In a world where talent is often dismissed by age, appearance, or circumstance, sometimes all it takes is one moment to shatter every expectation. This is the story of how a single request for just one shot transformed ridicule into respect, doubt into disbelief, and mockery into a moment that would be remembered forever. What happened next wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places, at the most unexpected times, when someone finally gets the chance they've been waiting for their entire life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Springfield shooting range as Margaret Thompson pulled into the gravel parking lot. At 73 years old, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to pace herself, but her eyes held a sharpness that belied her age. She had driven 2 hours from her small farm in rural Kentucky, her weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of her old pickup truck with determination. Margaret had never set foot on a professional shooting range before. The closest she had come to competitive shooting was the occasional practice session behind her farmhouse, where she would line up tin cans on fence posts and shoot with the rifle her late husband had taught her to use 40 years ago. But today was different. Today she was here because of a conversation that had changed everything. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret's grandson Tommy had visited the farm for his usual weekend stay. At 19, Tommy was full of enthusiasm for everything, especially his new hobby of competitive shooting. He had joined his college shooting team and couldn't stop talking about the upcoming regional championship that would be held at Springfield. He regaled his grandmother with stories of the incredible shooters he had met, their expensive equipment, and their years of professional training. "Grandma, you should see these people shoot," Tommy had said, polishing his rifle at the kitchen table. "They can hit targets from distances you wouldn't believe." There's this one guy, Marcus Reynolds, who holds the state record. He's been shooting professionally for 15 years and has all this high-tech gear. Nobody even comes close to his skill level. Margaret had listened quietly, occasionally nodding as she prepared dinner. But when Tommy mentioned that the championship was open to anyone willing to pay the entry fee, something stirred within her. She had always been a good shot, better than most men in her county, though she had never made a big deal about it. Shooting had been a practical skill on the farm, used for protecting livestock from predators and occasionally hunting for food during tough times. "You know, Tommy," she had said carefully, "your grandfather always said I had a natural eye for shooting. Maybe I should come watch this championship of yours." Tommy had laughed, not unkindly, but with the dismissive attitude of youth toward age. "That's different, Grandma. These are professionals with state-of-the-art equipment. It's not like shooting at tin cans in the backyard. Besides, most of these competitors have been training since they were teenagers."
The conversation might have ended there, but something about Tommy's tone, the gentle condescension in his voice, had awakened something in Margaret that had been dormant for too long. She had spent decades being underestimated, first as a woman in a male-dominated farming community, then as a widow trying to keep her farm running, and now as an elderly person whose opinions and abilities were often dismissed without consideration.
That night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Margaret had walked out to her back porch and picked up her rifle. Under the moonlight, she had set up a series of increasingly difficult targets, some as far as 300 yards away. One by one, she had hit them all, the familiar weight of the gun comfortable in her hands, her breathing steady and controlled. The muscle memory was still there, as strong as ever. Now, standing in the Springfield parking lot, Margaret felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had spent the past 3 weeks practicing daily, refining her technique and preparing mentally for what she was about to do. She had registered for the championship online, paying the $200 entry fee from her modest savings. When asked about her experience level on the registration form, she had simply written amateur. The shooting range was buzzing with activity. Competitors were setting up their equipment, checking and rechecking their rifles, and engaging in the kind of technical discussions that Margaret couldn't fully follow. She watched as they unpacked cases containing rifles that clearly cost more than some people's cars, complete with advanced scopes, adjustable stocks, and precision barrels. Their gear looked like something from a science fiction movie compared to her simple hunting rifle. Margaret made her way to the registration table, where a young man with a clipboard was checking in participants. He looked up as she approached, and she could see the confusion in his eyes as he tried to reconcile her appearance with the list of registered shooters. What did they do with the platness, which is also just as polite, clearly assuming she was lost or looking for someone. "I'm here to check in for the championship," Margaret said simply. Margaret Thompson. The young man scanned his list, found her name, and looked up at her again with obvious surprise.
"Oh, yes, you're on the list."
This is the book, it's about history. 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 I'm quite sure, Margaret replied, maintaining her calm demeanor despite the young man's obvious doubts. As she completed the check-in process, Margaret became aware of the attention she was drawing. Other competitors were beginning to notice the elderly woman among them, and conversations were starting to die down as people stared. She could hear whispered comments and barely suppressed chuckles from various directions. "Is that someone's grandmother?" she heard one competitor ask another. "Maybe she's here to watch her son or grandson compete," came the reply. "No. I heard her checking in. She's actually registered to shoot." "You've got to be kidding me. This is a serious competition, not some county fair shooting gallery." Margaret ignored the comments and made her way to the equipment area. Unlike the other competitors, she didn't have a fancy case or multiple rifle options. She simply carried her husband's old Winchester Model 70, a rifle that had been manufactured in 1981 and had seen countless hours of use on the farm. The wood stock was worn smooth from decades of handling, and while the rifle was well maintained, it looked distinctly out of place among the modern precision instruments surrounding it. As she began to prepare her rifle, a group of younger competitors approached her. She recognized the leader immediately from Tommy's descriptions, Marcus Reynolds, the state record holder. He was in his mid-30s, tall and athletic, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of success. His rifle alone probably cost more than Margaret's truck. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is the Regional Precision Shooting Championship. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Margaret looked up at him calmly. "I'm quite sure, young man. I've registered and paid my entry fee, just like everyone else." Marcus exchanged glances with his companions, and Margaret could see them struggling to maintain their composure. "Well, it's just that this is a pretty serious competition. The targets are at distances of up to 500 yards, and the margin of error is extremely small. Most of us have been training for years, specifically for this kind of precision work." "I understand the requirements," Margaret replied, continuing to prepare her rifle with practiced movements. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't think I could compete." One of Marcus's companions, a man in his 20s with expensive shooting glasses and a rifle that looked like it belonged in a military sniper unit, couldn't contain himself any longer. "Look, lady, no offense, but this isn't like shooting a deer or whatever you might be used to. These targets are barely visible at 500 yards, and we're talking about accuracy measured in fractions of inches. Maybe you should consider watching from the spectator area instead." Margaret finished checking her rifle's scope and looked up at the group surrounding her. She had faced condescension and doubt her entire life, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the accumulation of decades of being underestimated, or maybe it was the memory of her husband teaching her to shoot all those years ago, telling her she had a natural gift that shouldn't be wasted. Whatever it was, she felt a surge of quiet confidence. "I appreciate your concern," she said evenly. "But I didn't drive 2 hours just to watch. I came here to shoot." The group exchanged more glances, and she could see them making a decision about how to handle the situation. Marcus spoke again, his tone now carrying a hint of condescension that he wasn't bothering to hide completely. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't we make this interesting? How about a little warm-up round before the official competition starts? Just for fun. We can set up some targets at, say, 300 yards. Nothing too challenging. If you can hit the target consistently, then you've earned your place in the real competition. But if not," he shrugged, "maybe you'll see that this isn't really your level." Margaret considered the proposal. She could see that Marcus and his friends were setting her up for public embarrassment. They expected her to fail spectacularly, providing them with a good story to tell later and effectively pressuring her to withdraw from the competition. Around them, other competitors had stopped their preparations to listen to the exchange, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. The smart thing to do would be to decline the challenge and simply wait for the official competition to begin. But Margaret had spent too many years taking the smart, safe path, and too many years being dismissed without being given a real chance to prove herself. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to back down. "All right," she said simply. "Let's do it." A buzz of excitement ran through the crowd of competitors as word spread about the impromptu challenge. Someone set up targets at 300 yards, and a small crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. Margaret could hear the whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter as people positioned themselves for what they clearly expected to be an entertaining disaster. "This should be good," someone muttered behind her. I almost feel bad for her, another voice said. But hey, she asked for it. How much you want to bet she doesn't even hit the target? Came another comment, followed by quiet laughter. Margaret blocked out the noise and focused on preparing for the shot. She had been shooting at 300 yards regularly for the past 3 weeks, and she knew her rifle's capabilities at that distance. But shooting in front of a hostile crowd was different from shooting alone on her farm, and she could feel the pressure building. Marcus stepped up first, making a show of checking his equipment and adjusting his expensive scope. When he fired, his shot struck the target dead center, earning approving nods and comments from the crowd. 2 more of his companions followed, both placing their shots within inches of the bullseye. The message was clear. This was the level of accuracy expected, and anything less would be considered failure. Finally, it was Margaret's turn. As she approached the shooting line, the crowd fell silent, but she could feel the weight of their skepticism and amusement. She positioned herself carefully, raised her rifle, and looked through the simple scope that had served her well for decades. The target seemed small at 300 yards, but she had hit smaller objects at greater distances during her practice sessions. She controlled her breathing just as her husband had taught her 40 years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth, then hold. Her finger found the trigger, and she applied pressure slowly and steadily, just as she had thousands of times before. The rifle fired with a familiar crack, and Margaret lowered it, knowing instantly from the feel of the shot that it had been true. The silence stretched for several seconds as someone checked the target through binoculars. Then came the announcement that would change everything. Dead center, perfect bullseye. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and confused conversation. Margaret simply nodded, as if the result had been exactly what she expected. Marcus and his companions looked at each other with expressions of shock and growing concern. What they had intended as a casual humiliation had just backfired spectacularly. Lucky shot, one of them said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe, Margaret replied calmly, but I'd be happy to do it again if you'd like. The crowd was now fully engaged, and several people called for another round. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of having initiated a challenge that was not going according to plan. He had expected to send the old woman home embarrassed and discouraged. Instead, he was facing the possibility that she might actually be a legitimate threat in the upcoming competition. Fine, he said, trying to maintain his confident demeanor. Let's see if you can do it again. They reset the targets, and once again each of Marcus's group took their turns, all shooting with impressive accuracy. But when Margaret stepped up for her second shot, the crowd's attention was different now. Instead of waiting for comedy, they were genuinely curious to see if she could repeat her performance. Margaret took her position, went through the same breathing routine, and fired. Once again, the shot was perfect, striking the target so close to dead center that it was difficult to distinguish from her first shot. The crowd's reaction was notably different this time, with genuine applause mixed in with the surprised comments. By the time they had completed 3 rounds of the impromptu challenge, Margaret had outshot 2 of Marcus's companions and matched his own performance shot for shot. The laughter and dismissive comments had given way to respectful attention and growing excitement about the official competition that was about to begin. As the competitors dispersed to prepare for the championship rounds, Margaret could hear the whispered conversations taking on a different tone. Instead of mockery, there was genuine curiosity and, in some cases, concern about this unexpected challenger who had appeared from nowhere. Marcus approached her one more time as she was cleaning her rifle. His earlier condescension had been replaced by a mixture of respect and wariness. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. Margaret looked up at him with a slight smile. "My husband taught me 40 years ago. Said I had a natural eye for it. I guess he was right."
Have you ever competed professionally?
Never, Margaret replied honestly. This is my first competition of any kind.
Marcus stared at her for a long moment, clearly trying to process this information.
"Well," he said finally, "I guess we'll see what happens in the real thing." As Margaret prepared for the championship rounds that were about to begin, she reflected on how much had changed in just the past hour. She had come here as a complete unknown, dismissed and mocked by everyone present. But now, as the competitors took their positions for the official competition, she could feel the weight of genuine attention and respect. She had proven that she belonged here, at least for now. But the real test was just beginning. The championship would involve increasingly difficult shots at distances up to 500 yards, with scoring so precise that a difference of millimeters could determine the winner. Margaret had shown she could compete at 300 yards, but the championship would push every shooter to their absolute limits. As she settled into position for the first official round, Margaret thought about her late husband and how proud he would be to see her here. She thought about Tommy and wondered if he was watching the live stream that was being broadcast online. Most of all, she thought about all the years she had spent being underestimated and dismissed, and how good it felt to finally have the chance to show what she was truly capable of. The competition was about to begin, and Margaret Thompson was ready to show the world that sometimes the most dangerous competitor is the one nobody sees coming. The first official round of the championship began at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, with 43 competitors arranged along the firing line. Margaret found herself positioned between a young woman from the State University's shooting team and a middle-aged man who kept adjusting an elaborate rifle that looked more like a piece of scientific equipment than a hunting weapon. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for precision shooting. The rangemaster's voice echoed across the field as he announced the rules. The championship would consist of 5 rounds with distances increasing from 300 to 500 yards. Each shooter would have 10 shots per round with scoring based on proximity to the bullseye measured to the nearest tenth of an inch. The cumulative score across all rounds would determine the winner, with the current state record standing at 847 points out of a possible 1,000. Margaret listened carefully to the instructions while making final adjustments to her rifle. Around her, the other competitors were engaged in last-minute equipment checks, some making micro-adjustments to their scopes, others testing the wind with small pieces of tissue paper. The contrast between their high-tech preparations and Margaret's simple routine was stark. She simply checked that her rifle was clean, confirmed that her scope was properly zeroed, and waited for the signal to begin. The first round at 300 yards should have been routine for most of these experienced competitors, but Margaret's earlier performance during the impromptu challenge had changed the dynamics. Several shooters kept glancing in her direction, clearly wondering if her earlier accuracy had been luck or skill. The pressure was different now, with the knowledge that an unknown quantity was among them. When the signal came to begin the first round, Margaret settled into her shooting position with the same calm deliberation she had used during her practice sessions on the farm. The target at 300 yards looked familiar after weeks of preparation, and she began her methodical process of aiming and firing. 1 shot every 30 seconds. Breathing controlled, movement minimal. Each time she squeezed the trigger, she knew the shot was true before the bullet reached the target. By the time the first round was complete, the whispered conversations among spectators and competitors had taken on a different tone. Margaret's first 10 shots had produced a score that put her in 3rd place overall, behind only Marcus Reynolds and a professional shooter from the State Police tactical team. The woman from the university team sitting next to her turned with obvious surprise. "That's incredible shooting," she said genuinely. "I'm Sarah, by the way. I've never seen someone maintain that kind of consistency with equipment like yours."
Margaret, she replied with a slight smile. "And thank you."
The rifle may be old, but it shoots straight if you know how to use it. As they moved to the 400-yard line for the second round, Margaret noticed that the casual chatter among competitors had diminished significantly. The initial amusement at her presence had been replaced by focused attention to their own performance. She had gone from being a curiosity to being a genuine threat, and the atmosphere reflected that shift. The second round presented new challenges. At 400 yards, the targets appeared significantly smaller, and even minor errors in technique would be magnified. The wind, which had been negligible during the first round, was beginning to pick up slightly, adding an additional variable that the shooters would need to account for. Margaret watched the grass and leaves around the range, reading the wind patterns the way her husband had taught her decades ago. Marcus Reynolds, shooting 2 positions down from Margaret, was clearly feeling the pressure of defending his record. His first shot of the round was slightly off-center, earning him a score that was good but not exceptional. Margaret could see him making adjustments to his scope and changing his shooting position slightly. The confident demeanor he had displayed earlier was giving way to the intense focus of someone who realized he was in a real competition. Margaret's approach to the second round was identical to her approach to the first. She ignored the increased distance and the subtle wind, trusting her instincts and the thousands of hours she had spent shooting in various conditions on the farm. Her first shot at 400 yards was another bullseye, drawing audible gasps from some of the spectators who had gathered to watch the unexpected drama unfolding. As the second round progressed, Margaret maintained her steady performance while several other competitors began to show signs of stress. The young woman next to her, Sarah, was clearly struggling with the increased distance, and 2 other shooters had scores that would effectively eliminate them from contention for the championship. By the end of the second round, Margaret had moved into 2nd place overall, just 3 points behind Marcus Reynolds. During the break between rounds, Margaret noticed that the crowd of spectators had grown significantly. Word was spreading through the shooting community about the elderly woman who was competing with champions and professionals using a 40-year-old hunting rifle. Several people approached her with questions about her background and training, but she politely deflected most inquiries, preferring to focus on the remaining rounds. Tommy called during the break. Margaret had given him the range's phone number in case of emergencies, and he had been following the competition online through the live scoring updates. His voice was filled with amazement and disbelief. "Grandma, I can't believe what I'm seeing," he said. "You're in second place. Second place. How is this possible?" "I told you your grandfather was right about my shooting," Margaret replied calmly. "I just needed the right opportunity to show it. But these are some of the best shooters in the region. Marcus Reynolds is practically a legend. How are you keeping up with them?" Marcus considered the question for a moment. "Son, I've been shooting longer than most of these people have been alive. The equipment may be fancier now, but the fundamentals haven't changed. Breathe right, aim true, squeeze smooth. Everything else is just decoration." The third round at 450 yards would be the turning point of the competition. At this distance, only the most skilled and experienced shooters could maintain consistent accuracy. The targets were barely visible to the naked eye, and even the slightest error in judgment or technique would result in shots missing the scoring rings entirely. Margaret noticed that several competitors were beginning to show visible signs of nervousness. Hand tremors, inconsistent breathing, and rushed shots were becoming more common as the pressure mounted. The field was separating into two distinct groups, those who could handle the distance and pressure, and those who were beginning to fall behind. Marcus Reynolds had regained some of his composure, and was shooting with the precision that had earned him his reputation. His first few shots of the third round were excellent, and Margaret could see him beginning to relax as he found his rhythm. But she also noticed something that the crowd and other competitors hadn't picked up on. Marcus was using a different shooting technique than she was, one that was more dependent on perfect equipment and controlled conditions. Margaret's technique, learned decades ago from her husband and refined through years of practical shooting on the farm, was more adaptable to varying conditions. Where Marcus made precise calculations and equipment adjustments for wind and distance, Margaret relied more on instinct and experience. Her approach was less scientific but potentially more resilient under pressure. As the third round progressed, the gap between Margaret and Marcus began to narrow. Her shots remained consistently in the high-scoring rings, while Marcus had two shots that were slightly off target, costing him valuable points. By the end of the round, Margaret had taken the lead by a single point, a development that sent shockwaves through the crowd and competitors alike. The announcement of the standings after the third round created a buzz of excitement and disbelief. Margaret Thompson, the unknown 73-year-old grandmother from rural Kentucky, was leading the regional championship ahead of seasoned professionals and champions. The impossible was happening, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. During the break before the fourth round, Margaret found herself surrounded by reporters and photographers. The local sporting goods store that sponsored the event had called a local newspaper, and word was spreading on social media about the remarkable story unfolding at the Springfield Range. Margaret handled the attention with the same calm grace she had shown throughout the competition, answering questions politely but keeping her focus on the remaining rounds. "Mrs.
Thompson," one reporter asked, "did you ever imagine when you woke up this morning that you'd be leading this championship?"
"I came here to shoot my best," Margaret replied simply. "Whether that would be good enough to win, I didn't know."
But I didn't come here just to participate. The fourth round, at 475 yards, would test even the most experienced shooters. At this distance, the targets were barely discernible dots, and the margin for error was essentially zero. The slightest movement, the tiniest miscalculation, or even a momentary lapse in concentration could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Margaret approached the fourth round with the same methodical preparation she had used for the previous three. She studied the wind patterns, checked her rifle one more time, and settled into her shooting position. Around her, she could feel the tension and pressure from the other competitors, but she had learned long ago how to block out distractions and focus solely on the task at hand. Her first shot of the fourth round was another perfect bullseye, drawing amazed reactions from the crowd and impressed nods from fellow competitors. Marcus, shooting immediately after her, matched her shot with one of his own, maintaining the close competition that was captivating everyone present. As the fourth round progressed, the field of serious contenders had narrowed to just three shooters: Margaret, Marcus, and Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison from the State Police Tactical Team. Everyone else was too far behind to have any realistic chance of winning. The competition had become a three-way battle, with each shot potentially decisive. Margaret's performance in the fourth round was perhaps her most impressive yet. Shooting at a distance that challenged even professional snipers, She maintained her consistent accuracy while other competitors struggled with the extreme range.
Her final shot of the round was so perfectly centered that it drew spontaneous applause from the crowd, something that rarely happened during competitive shooting events. When the fourth round scores were announced, Margaret had extended her lead to 4 points over Marcus Reynolds, with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison trailing by 8 points.
With 1 round remaining, Margaret was in position to achieve something that seemed impossible just a few hours earlier, winning a regional championship in her first competitive shooting event. But the final round would be at 500 yards, a distance that would test the limits of both equipment and skill. At half a kilometer, the targets would be barely visible even through high-powered scopes, and atmospheric conditions would play a major role in bullet trajectory. This was where superior equipment and extensive training typically made the difference, and where Margaret's simple rifle and instinctive shooting style would face their greatest test. During the break before the final round, Margaret called her grandson Tommy again. This time his voice was filled with excitement and nervous energy.
"Grandma, the whole internet is talking about you," he said. "There are videos of your shots being shared everywhere.
People are calling you the granny sniper and the farm sharpshooter. Do you realize how amazing this is?" Margaret chuckled softly.
"I'm just doing what your grandfather taught me to do, Tommy. Shoot straight and don't let the pressure get to you."
"But do you think you can win? I mean, 500 yards is incredibly difficult, and Marcus Reynolds is one of the best shooters in the country." Margaret looked out at the distant targets, barely visible even with the naked eye.
"I don't know, son.
But I've come this far, and I'm not going to change anything now. Whatever happens in the final round, I'll know I gave it my best effort."
As the competitors prepared for the final round, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The crowd had grown to include people who had never shown interest in competitive shooting before, all drawn by the incredible story of the grandmother who was challenging champions with a decades-old rifle and a lifetime of farm-learned skills. Margaret looked around at the faces of her fellow competitors and saw a mixture of respect, nervousness, and determination. Win or lose, she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had proven that skill and determination could overcome assumptions and stereotypes. She had shown that champions could emerge from the most unexpected places. But as she prepared for the final 10 shots that would determine the championship, Margaret knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The final round at 500 yards began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with the sun positioned perfectly to avoid glare, but still provide adequate lighting for the extreme distance shooting. The crowd had grown to over 200 people, including several news crews that had arrived after hearing about the extraordinary competition taking place. Margaret Thompson, the 73-year-old grandmother who had never competed professionally before, was about to attempt 10 shots that could make her a regional champion and potentially set a new record. The atmosphere on the firing line was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, hear the whispered conversations and camera shutters clicking, sense the nervous energy radiating from the other competitors. But as she settled into her shooting position and looked through her scope at the distant target, all of that faded away. There was only her, the rifle, and the target 500 yards downrange. Marcus Reynolds, positioned 3 spots to her left, was visibly tense for the first time all day. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the intense focus of someone who knew his reputation and record were genuinely threatened. He had spent 15 years building his career as a competitive shooter, earning sponsors and recognition throughout the region. The possibility of losing to a complete amateur using equipment older than some of his competitors was clearly weighing on him. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, representing the final serious contender, was checking and rechecking his equipment with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. His military training had prepared him for pressure, but nothing in his experience had been quite like this. He was facing not just the challenge of extreme distance shooting, but the psychological pressure of competing against someone who had already defied every expectation. The rangemaster's voice cut through the tension as he announced the final round parameters. 10 shots, 500 yards, maximum possible score of 200 points. The current regional record held by Marcus Reynolds stood at 847 points, total across all 5 rounds. Margaret's current total of 684 points meant she needed a score of at least 164 in the final round to break the record, a performance that would require near-perfect shooting at the most challenging distance. Margaret's first shot of the final round came after nearly 2 minutes of careful preparation. At 500 yards, she could barely see the target through her simple scope, and she had to rely heavily on the shooting instincts developed over decades of practice. The wind had picked up slightly, creating another variable that could affect bullet trajectory over the long distance. She watched the grass and leaves around the range,
reading the wind patterns the way her husband had taught her 40 years earlier.
When she finally squeezed the trigger, the familiar crack of her rifle seemed to echo longer than usual in the still afternoon air. The target was too distant for immediate visual confirmation of the hit, and everyone had to wait for the electronic scoring system to register the impact. When the score appeared on the display board, showing a perfect 20-point bullseye, the crowd erupted in amazed applause. Marcus followed with his first shot, which scored 19 points, just slightly off center. It was an excellent shot by any standard, but in a competition this close, every point mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's first shot also scored 19 points, keeping the three-way race tight but giving Margaret a slight early advantage in the crucial final round. As the final round progressed, the pressure continued to mount. Margaret's shooting style, which had served her well throughout the competition, was now being tested to its absolute limits. At 500 yards, the kind of instinctive shooting that worked on her farm required almost supernatural precision. Yet somehow, she continued to find the target with remarkable consistency. Her second shot scored another perfect 20, followed by a 19 on her third attempt. Marcus, clearly feeling the pressure, had a shot that scored only 17 points, his worst of the entire competition. The crowd could sense that something historic was happening and the excitement was becoming palpable. By the midpoint of the final round, Margaret's performance was approaching legendary status. She had scored 4 perfect bullseyes and one 19-point shot in her first 5 attempts, putting her on pace not just to win the championship, but to shatter the existing record by a significant margin. The mathematical possibility was becoming a likely reality, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Tommy had arrived at the Grange during the final round, having driven frantically from his college campus after following the competition online. He found a spot near the back of the crowd, hardly able to believe what he was seeing. The grandmother, who had quietly listened to his dismissive comments about competitive shooting just weeks earlier, was now dominating a field of champions and professionals. "I can't believe this is happening," he whispered to a stranger standing next to him.
"That's my grandmother up there."
The stranger turned to look at him with amazement. "Your grandmother?
She's incredible. I've never seen shooting like this in 30 years of following the sport."
Margaret's sixth shot of the final round was perhaps the most crucial of the entire competition. The wind had shifted slightly, and she had to make an adjustment to her aim point while maintaining the same smooth trigger pull that had served her well all day.
This shot felt perfect as soon as she fired it, and when the score of 20 appeared on the display board, she knew she was within reach of something truly special. Marcus Reynolds, meanwhile, was struggling with the pressure in a way that surprised everyone who knew his reputation.
His 6 shots scored only 16 points, effectively ending his chances of defending his record. The realization that he was being outshot by an amateur using basic equipment seemed to affect his concentration, and his technique began to deteriorate under the stress. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison continued to shoot consistently, but not at the level needed to challenge Margaret's extraordinary performance. His military training helped him maintain his composure, but he lacked the instinctive connection to his rifle that Margaret had developed over decades of practical shooting experience.
As Margaret prepared for her 7th shot, the crowd fell silent in anticipation. She was now just 4 shots away from completing one of the most remarkable athletic performances in recent memory. The mathematical calculations being whispered among spectators confirmed what everyone could sense. She was on pace to break the record by more than 20 points, a margin that would be considered dominant in any competitive shooting event. Her 7th shot was another perfect bullseye, drawing gasps and applause from the crowd.
Margaret allowed herself a small smile as she prepared for her 8th attempt. She had never imagined when she woke up that morning that she would be in this position, but now that she was here, she felt a sense of calm confidence that surprised even her.
The 8th shot scored 19 points, still an excellent result that kept her well ahead of the record pace. Marcus had essentially given up on defending his record and was simply trying to finish the competition with dignity intact. His body language showed the defeat of someone who had been thoroughly outclassed by a competitor he had initially dismissed as irrelevant. Margaret's 9th shot was the moment when everyone present realized they were witnessing history. Another perfect bullseye, her 7th of the final round, put her total score at an unprecedented level. The existing record of 847 points was not just going to be broken, it was going to be obliterated by a margin that would stand as testimony to one of the greatest individual performances in competitive shooting history.
As she prepared for her final shot, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She remembered her husband teaching her to shoot behind their farmhouse, telling her she had a natural gift that shouldn't be wasted. She thought about all the years when that gift had gone unrecognized, used only for practical purposes on the farm.
She reflected on the condescension and mockery she had faced earlier that morning, and how satisfying it felt to prove that assumptions about age and experience could be completely wrong. What is it coming?
The crowd was absolutely silent as Margaret settled into position for her 10th and final shot. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for this moment. She went through her familiar routine, checked the wind, adjust her position, controlled her breathing, find the target through her scope, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The shot felt perfect the moment it left the rifle, and Margaret knew before the score appeared that she had achieved something special. When the final score of 20 points flashed on the display board, the crowd erupted in the longest and loudest applause of the day. Margaret Thompson had completed the final round with a score of 191 out of 200 points, giving her a total championship score of 875 points and breaking the previous record by 28 points. But the remarkable nature of her achievement went beyond just the record-breaking score. Analysis of her performance would later show that she had been incredibly consistent throughout all 5 rounds, with no significant drop-off in accuracy, even as the distances increased and pressure mounted. Her final round score of 191 was not just a personal best, it was one of the highest single-round scores ever recorded in regional competition at that distance.
Marcus Reynolds was the first to congratulate her, approaching with genuine respect and admiration despite his disappointment at losing his record.
"That was the most incredible shooting I've ever witnessed," he said, shaking her hand.
"I've been competing for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone shoot with that kind of consistency under pressure." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison added his congratulations, telling Margaret that her performance reminded him of the best military snipers he had worked with during his career.
"The difference is," he said with a smile, "most of those guys had years of specialized training and equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. What you did today with that old hunting rifle is simply amazing." As Margaret accepted the championship trophy and the ceremonial check for the prize money, she was surrounded by reporters eager to understand how such an extraordinary performance had been possible. Her answers were characteristically modest and straightforward. "I had a good teacher 40 years ago," she told one television reporter. "My husband taught me that shooting isn't about having the fanciest equipment or the most technical knowledge. It's about understanding your rifle, reading the conditions, and staying calm under pressure. Everything else is just decoration." When asked about her plans for the future, Margaret surprised everyone with her answer. "I think I might try a few more competitions," she said with a slight smile. "I've discovered I rather enjoy this." Tommy found her in the crowd and hugged her tightly, tears in his eyes. "Grandma, I'm so sorry for what I said before. I had no idea you could shoot like this." Margaret patted his back gently. "You weren't wrong to be skeptical, Tommy. I hadn't proven anything yet. But your grandfather always said that the only way to really show what you're capable of is to step up when it matters most. Today, I finally got that chance." The story of Margaret Thompson's remarkable championship victory spread rapidly through social media and traditional news outlets. Within hours, videos of her shooting were being viewed by millions of people around the world. She received interview requests from major television networks and offers from shooting equipment manufacturers who wanted her endorsement. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other elderly individuals who had been inspired by her example. Letters and emails poured in from people who had given up on pursuing their dreams or demonstrating their abilities because of assumptions about age and capability. Margaret's victory had shown that it's never too late to surprise the world and yourself. The shooting sports community was equally impressed and humbled by her performance. Many competitors and coaches acknowledged that her victory had forced them to reconsider their assumptions about what makes a champion shooter. Her success with basic equipment and instinctive technique challenged the prevailing wisdom that success in competitive shooting required expensive gear and formal training. Margaret returned to her farm the next day carrying the championship trophy and a new understanding of her own capabilities. The routine of farm life resumed quickly, but with one significant change. She began receiving regular visits from young shooters who wanted to learn from the woman who had redefined what was possible in competitive shooting. 6 months later, Margaret won her second regional championship, followed by a third-place finish at the national level. She had become a fixture in the competitive shooting world, respected not just for her remarkable ability but for her grace, humility, and willingness to share her knowledge with others. But when people asked her about her success, Margaret always returned to the same themes: the importance of good fundamentals, the value of experience over equipment, and the power of staying calm under pressure. She had proven that sometimes the most dangerous competitor is indeed the one nobody sees coming, and that true champions can emerge from the most unexpected places when they finally get their chance to shine.
The record she set that day stood for 3 years before being broken by a professional shooter using the latest technology and training methods. But Margaret's performance remained legendary in the shooting community, not just for the score she achieved, but for the circumstances under which she achieved it. She had walked into a world that didn't expect much from her and had walked out as a champion, proving that assumptions about age, experience, and equipment can be completely wrong when faced with genuine skill and determination. Her story became an inspiration far beyond the shooting sports, serving as a reminder that it's never too late to pursue excellence, that champions can come from anywhere, and that sometimes all someone needs is just one shot to change everything.